The VP said I was finished like he was deleting a name from a spreadsheet. So I smiled, closed one window, and watched the room keep breathing on borrowed seconds. Because some people mistake silence for weakness right before the system reminds them who keeps it alive. By 8:12 that morning, the office already smelled like burnt coffee, printer heat, and ambition pretending to be strategy, the kind of ambition that wore expensive shoes, spoke in sharp little verdicts, and never once asked who actually kept the place from collapsing. I was in network operations on the 23rd floor, where crises arrived quietly first. A delayed sync, a sluggish terminal, a failed handshake in a regional node that nobody noticed until money started moving slower than executives liked. Our world never exploded all at once. It flickered, it stuttered, it cleared its throat, and if you knew how to listen, you could hear disaster walking down the hallway in polished leather. That morning, I heard it before I saw it. My screen glowed with 6 open dashboards, 3 live environment alerts, and 1 red dependency chain I did not like at all. A core routing failover path tied to an old finance integration. Ugly, fragile, deeply corporate. The kind of thing that existed because 5 people had signed off on temporary fixes over 4 years and then left the company with farewell cupcakes and carefully edited LinkedIn posts. I had just opened the Access audit logs when Ava from Treasury messaged me. "Are you seeing lag on approval traffic?" "Not yet," I typed back. Then, after half a second, "But I think I'm about to." That was the thing about working long enough in places like this. You stopped reacting to noise, you reacted to patterns, tiny shifts, odd timing, executive visits to technical floors, finance teams asking soft questions in hard tones. The air itself changed, like a theater right before the curtain rose on something expensive and humiliating. And right on cue, the elevator doors opened. He stepped out with 2 HR faces and the kind of smile men practice for promotions and funerals. The new VP Daniel Cross, 40-something navy suit, silver watch, confidence lacquered so thick it reflected the ceiling lights. He had been in the company exactly 11 days and was already walking like he personally invented authority. People stopped typing the way people do in offices when danger is wearing a badge instead of a mask. Cross didn't glance at anyone else. He came straight to my station. "From this minute," he said, voice clipped, public, deliberate, "you're out. No greeting, no meeting room, no paperwork first, just the line dropped in the center of the floor like a glass on marble. For one surreal second, all I heard was the hum of cooling fans inside my workstation. Then the room did what rooms always do when power speaks too loudly. It went still. Not silent, never silent, but still in that terrible, alert way. Chairs paused mid-turn. A pen stopped clicking. Someone near storage pretended to keep working while very obviously listening with their entire soul. I looked up at him. He looked pleased. That was the first interesting thing. Men who are certain they're right usually look impatient. Men who are performing certainty look pleased. There's a difference. One carries force, the other carries an audience. "I'm in the middle of active monitoring," I said calmly. "You're in the middle of leaving," he replied. The HR woman to his left gave me the sort of sympathetic expression that exists mostly to protect the person wearing it. Not cruel, not kind, just compliant, like a decorative lamp switched on in a room with no windows. Cross slid a printed sheet across my desk as if this were theater and props mattered. "Effective immediately. Your access will be revoked. Security will walk you through next steps." I glanced at the paper but didn't touch it. Around us, monitors continued to blink. Approvals continued to process. Regional traffic still moved through infrastructure that had been patched, nested, tied off, rerouted, and coaxed into stability by people nobody invited to strategy dinners. People like me. Revoked by whom? I asked. A tiny crease appeared between his brows. Excuse me? Access, I said, turning slightly toward my screen. Revoked by whom? He let out a short laugh, the kind meant to shrink the other person by refusing the seriousness of the question. By leadership. There it was. Not IT, not security governance, not compliance, not a formal offboarding chain. Leadership. A word people use when process is inconvenient. I finally picked up the document. The date was correct. My name was correct. The formatting was not. Wrong version header, wrong internal code, wrong sign-off path. I didn't need 10 seconds to see it. I needed 2. Interesting, very interesting. You moved quickly, I said. We move efficiently now, he answered. That almost made me smile, because efficient men love locked doors until they realize the hinges have names. I turned back to my screen and entered 2 commands, not dramatic ones, not destructive, not reckless, clean, reversible, defensible, session isolation, privileged credential freeze, temporary closure of my own elevated pathways pending legal validation, the digital equivalent of placing company keys in a sealed envelope and writing openness with witnesses across the front. Cross took 1 step forward. What are you doing? Protecting the environment, I said, his tone sharpened. Step away from the keyboard. I am documenting access state at the moment of involuntary removal without proper technical chain approval. One of the analysts 2 rows down stopped pretending not to listen. I could feel it now, that change in the room, subtle but electric, the shift from sympathy to attention. Because people in corporate towers know many kinds of power, but they respect only 2. The power that signs their salary and the power that can explain exactly what will break after lunch. Cross leaned down slightly, too close, too polished. You do not make decisions here anymore. I met his eyes. That would concern me more if you understood what I was connected to. His jaw moved once. Small thing, almost nothing. But almost nothing is where the truth likes to hide. Behind him, one of the large wall monitors refreshed. Treasury approval latency spiked, just for a moment, then dipped, then spiked again. Tiny wave, first tremor. Ava sent another message. Now I'm seeing it. What changed? I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, because I was suddenly very curious who else would notice. Cross must have caught movement in my face because he turned toward the monitor, then back at me. Is that related to you? The question came out too fast, too direct. There it was again, not certainty, performance. No, I said evenly. That's related to architecture. He straightened. Escort her out. The security officer near the aisle hesitated. That was the second interesting thing. Good security people know the difference between removing a person and removing a function. One is routine. The other is a gamble with fluorescent lighting. I closed the last privileged console, opened the audit recorder, and signed the live administrative handoff suspension with my employee certificate. Time-stamped, logged, clean. Then I stood. No scene, no tears, no speeches, just the quiet scrape of a chair and the soft click of my badge lanyard against the desk. Cross looked relieved too early. I picked up my coat, my notebook, and the printed termination sheet. On the top line, under authorization routing, one field was blank, not missing by accident, missing like someone thought the floor would be empty by the time questions caught up. As I stepped away from the station, the wall monitor refreshed again. Treasury latency rose, external vendor handshake delay, finance queue dependency warning, still manageable, still explainable, Still deniable, for now. I paused just long enough to look at Daniel Cross and say, in the same tone I used for failed systems and fragile people, you may want someone from finance in your next conversation. He gave me a cold smile. Why? I slipped the folded paper into my bag. Because by then I had already seen the dependency string. Because buried under 3 layers of legacy logic and one very arrogant org chart, was a number no executive should ever ignore. Because somewhere upstairs, whether they knew it or not, $70 million was traveling through infrastructure held together by process, sequencing, and one woman they had just tried to remove like a nameplate from a door. But I only said because they tend to care when the delay starts costing real money. Then I walked toward the elevator while the floor stayed frozen behind me, suspended in that brittle corporate half-light where everyone senses the story has changed, but nobody knows yet in whose favor. The doors opened with a polished chime. Inside the mirrored wall of the elevator, I caught my own reflection, calm face, steady hands, eyes brighter than they should have been. Not afraid. Not yet, just listening. Because in companies like ours, collapse never begins with shouting. It begins with one wrong signature, one missing approval path, one executive who mistakes control for comprehension. And upstairs, somewhere above the glass and steel and rehearsed authority, the first serious question was probably just beginning to form. Who exactly had he just fired? The elevator doors closed with that soft, expensive hush designed to make corporate exits feel civilized, as if polished steel could turn humiliation into procedure. I stood alone inside the mirrored box, my badge still hanging at my waist, my pulse surprisingly even. 23 floors above the lobby, Daniel Cross was probably already breathing easier. He had done what new executives love doing in their first weeks: make something public, make it sharp, make it look decisive. In boardrooms, that passes for leadership far more often than anyone admits. The elevator began to descend, 22, 21, and then my phone vibrated. Not a call, a burst, 3 messages in less than 4 seconds. Ava, we just got an approval freeze on 2 treasury chains. Martin, infra, did you touch auth routing? Unknown internal extension. Who suspended elevated session inheritance? I looked at the screen and almost laughed. There it was, not the explosion, the intake of breath before it. I answered Martin first. I secured my own privileged pathways during involuntary offboarding without technical chain sign-off. Check the logs. 3 dots appeared instantly, disappeared, reappeared. Then came his reply. You're kidding. He removed you without architecture? I didn't answer that one, because the answer was already spreading floor by floor like cold air under a locked door. 19, 18. The lobby felt suddenly very far away. By the time the elevator reached 16, the messages had multiplied. Network ops, treasury, a quiet analyst from vendor security who had never once written me anything longer than received. Even compliance. The same pattern over and over, wrapped in different wording. What changed? Why is finance lagging? Who approved this? Is this related to the access freeze? It was almost beautiful in a cruel sort of way, like watching a chandelier tremble before anyone looks up. The security officer beside me cleared his throat gently. He had joined on floor 22 after Cross gave the order. Mid-50s, careful posture, tired eyes that had seen enough corporate theater to know when not to clap. Ma'am, he said, not unkindly, I'm supposed to escort you to HR. Of course. He glanced at my phone, lighting up again and again. Rough timing. That earned him the smallest smile. Timing, I said, slipping the phone into my coat pocket, is usually the whole story. When the doors opened into the executive transfer corridor on 14, Two people stepped in and immediately stopped talking when they saw me. Finance. Not junior finance either, real finance. The kind who only ride this elevator when numbers are either making history or threatening to. One of them, a man in a charcoal suit with rimless glasses, recognized me. His eyes narrowed for half a second. "You're from network dependency," he said. "Operations architecture," I corrected. He looked at the security officer, then back at me. "Do you know why Treasury approvals just flagged a regional delay?" I could feel the entire elevator listening without moving. "I know why they might," I said. He held my gaze. "And?" I tilted my head slightly toward the glowing panel above the door, where the floors kept ticking down, indifferent and precise. "And this doesn't look like the right place for a diagnostic conversation." The woman beside him exhaled through her nose. Barely, but enough. Not annoyance, recognition. She knew exactly what I meant. There are conversations that happen in offices, and there are conversations that happen after someone realizes the office has been pretending. By the time we reached 12, the man had already pulled out his phone. "Get me live Treasury dependency status," he said to someone on the line. A pause. Then his expression changed. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just enough to strip 10 years off his executive calm. "How much?" he asked. Another pause. His jaw tightened. "No, say it again." The elevator was silent now in the purest sense of the word. Not awkward, not empty, charged. He didn't repeat the answer for everyone. He didn't need to. The woman next to him simply turned toward me and asked very quietly, "Who authorized your removal?" There are moments when truth arrives wearing no perfume at all. No presentation, no spin, just clean shoes and terrible timing. I reached into my bag, unfolded the termination sheet, and handed it to her. She scanned the first page. Her eyes moved once, then again, slower this time. "He used this routing?" she said. I said nothing. The man looked over her shoulder. "This isn't fully signed." "No," I said, "it isn't." "And he revoked her access anyway?" the woman asked. "Attempted to," I said. A faint color rose in her face, the kind that means somebody in another part of the building is about to have a very uncomfortable 5 minutes. 8, 7. My phone rang, not vibrated, rang. The caller ID made the security officer glance sideways. CFO office. No title, no assistant name, just that. The woman from finance looked at the screen in my hand and then at me as if the hallway walls had quietly changed materials. I answered, "This is Elena Markova." The voice on the other end was low, controlled, and moving too fast beneath the surface. "Ms. Markova, this is Richard Vale, the CFO himself. Interesting, very interesting. I'm told there is a live dependency issue tied to your access state," he said. No wasted words, no ego lacquer. That was the difference between performance and pressure. One announced itself, the other started asking for numbers. "There is a dependency chain tied to managed authorization continuity," I said. My elevated access was not the danger. The sequence of removal was. The elevator stopped on 6. The finance pair did not get out. "Can you stabilize it?" he asked. Not "would you like to?" Not "is it possible?" Straight to the only question the building cared about now. I looked at my reflection in the mirrored panel. Calm face, pale light, security badge. Folded termination notice in the hand of a woman from finance who no longer looked even slightly detached. "Yes," I said, a pause. Then, "Where are you?" "Between 6 and the lobby," I replied. "Do not leave the building." That almost made me laugh. 5 minutes ago, I was being escorted out like a risk factor with lipstick. Now the CFO was speaking to me the way people speak to oxygen during a fire. The elevator resumed its descent. I need a secure room, read-only review access, architecture witness, and legal observation, I said. No verbal shortcuts, no hallway directives, and no one touches the current audit state. Done, he said immediately. The woman from finance closed her eyes for one brief second, perhaps because she knew exactly what that one word cost somewhere upstairs. Then the CFO added, "One more thing. Is the 70 million figure real?" There it was. The number had surfaced. The room inside the elevator seemed to contract around it. It's real if the delay cascades through treasury approvals and vendor settlement timing, I said. And if someone keeps treating infrastructure like furniture? Silence. Not empty silence. The expensive kind. The kind that follows a sentence nobody wants repeated because it is too accurate. When Richard Vale spoke again, his tone had changed by less than a degree, but enough to matter. Come to Executive Conference B. Security will redirect. You will not be processed through HR. The line ended. No goodbye, no reassurance, just velocity. The security officer looked at me with the expression of a man whose simple afternoon had been stolen by organizational truth. "Well," he said softly, "that seems different." "Only by title," I answered. The elevator opened on the lobby, but nobody moved. A moment later, his radio crackled. He listened, nodded once, and then pressed the button for 18. Back up, of course. That was always the joke, wasn't it? In companies like ours, they send you downward when they think you're disposable. They send you back up when they finally read the dependency report. As the doors closed again, my phone lit with one final message from Ava. Treasury says CFO is in a closed room escalation. People are saying the system depends on one person. Please tell me that isn't as bad as it sounds. I stared at the words for a second, then I looked up at the glowing floor numbers climbing higher and higher, carrying me back toward the same people who had just watched me be removed. Only now the building knew something it had not known 10 minutes earlier. A woman could be escorted away from her desk, but a dependency could not. And somewhere on the 23rd floor, Daniel Cross was probably still standing in the wreckage of his own confidence, not yet understanding that the most dangerous moment in corporate life is not when you fire the wrong person. It is when finance learns exactly what that person was holding together. If you've ever watched someone powerful make one arrogant decision too fast, hit like and subscribe. Because this story is only getting sharper. The report is on the table, the room is closing in, and the people who thought she was easy to remove are about to learn what real leverage looks like. Executive Conference B was one of those rooms designed to make bad decisions feel expensive instead of reckless. Long black table, frosted glass, silent climate control, a wall screen large enough to display a quarterly lie in glorious high definition. The kind of room where people lowered their voices not out of respect, but because money always sounded more serious when spoken softly. When I walked in, 3 things happened at once. The first was that everyone looked up. The second was that nobody smiled. And the third was that Daniel Cross, standing near the far end of the table with one hand braced against the leather chair, realized before anyone said a word that this room was no longer arranged around him. CFO Richard Vale stood at the head of the table, jacket unbuttoned, one palm resting on a printed report already marked with 2 diagonal pen lines and one hard circle around a number that had turned the building pale. $70 million treasury exposure, projected, conditional, real enough to stop breathing over. To his right sat General Counsel Miriam Sloan, composed in the way only dangerous lawyers and surgeons ever truly are. Next to her, a senior architect from Enterprise Systems had already opened a stack of dependency maps and looked deeply offended by reality. On the left side of the table were two finance directors, a compliance lead, and a silent assistant typing notes so fast her keyboard sounded like rain on glass. There was an empty chair halfway down the table. Mine. No one had to tell me. That was the smallest apology the company knew how to make. Furniture. Ms. Markova, said Vale, sit. I did. Cross did not. Interesting. He remained standing, but it was no longer the stance of a man in command. It was the stance of a man trying not to look like he had just slipped on a floor only he believed was solid. Vale nodded once toward the wall screen. Walk us through it. No preamble. Good. I reached for the remote, brought up the live dependency chain, and the room filled with colored lines, node clusters, authentication bridges, and the kind of architecture executives call back-end when they want to sound informed without becoming accountable. This, I said, enlarging the central path, is Treasury approval continuity. It routes through managed authorization inheritance during restricted settlement windows. Those windows overlap with vendor reconciliation and regional release timing. Under normal circumstances, the system is stable because escalated access can be transferred in sequence. I clicked again. A side chain lit up. Under abnormal circumstances, I continued, someone removes a primary continuity holder without technical sign-off, architecture witness, or legal sequencing. I did not look at Cross when I said it. I didn't need to. The sentence landed where it needed to. The senior architect leaned forward. This inheritance path was still tied to a named holder? Yes, I said, because the migration request to role abstraction was postponed twice. By whom? I tapped the archived changelog open on the side panel. There it was, dates, approvals, delay notes, budget deferrals. One of the finance directors exhaled slowly through his nose. The postponement had not come from network operations. Of course it hadn't. Legacy risk is almost never created by the people blamed for surviving it. It remained stable, I said, because I maintained manual continuity controls pending transition. Vale's expression did not change, but one of his fingers stopped tapping the table. And when Mr. Cross attempted immediate removal, he asked, I locked my own elevated pathways to prevent unobserved reassignment, ghost access exposure, or an unlogged credentials handoff. I paused. In plain language, I sealed the engine before someone tried to swap drivers on a moving highway. That line finally made the assistant stop typing for half a heartbeat. Miriam Sloan, the general counsel, folded her hands. Was that action compliant? Yes, I said. Cross moved then, just enough to insert himself back into the frame. She froze live access after being terminated, he said. That is not a neutral action. His voice had changed, less polished now, thinner around the edges. The room heard it too. I turned slightly toward Miriam, not him. The action was taken after I was presented with an incomplete termination document using an invalid routing path and before any lawful technical handover occurred, I said. So yes, neutral, documented, defensible. Miriam extended her hand without taking her eyes off me. The document? One of the finance women passed it over. Miriam reviewed the first page, then the second, then flipped back to the first with the stillness of someone finding exactly what she expected and disliking it anyway. Who drafted this? She asked. Cross answered too quickly. HR prepared it under my authority. Under your authority is not a department, she said. The room went very still. There it was, the first clean incision. Cross lifted his chin. I made an executive decision based on operational restructuring. Using the wrong document version, Miriam replied. No one moved. Without legal sequence, she added. Still no one moved. Without security governance authorization, a beat, and without full risk review on a named critical dependency holder. She placed the paper flat on the table like something mildly contaminated. Then she looked up at him. That was the moment the temperature changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but every person in that room felt it, the way people feel when an elevator cable shivers exactly once. Cross tried the executive version of recovery, confidence with cleaner vowels. We cannot allow technical staff to hold operational leverage over business continuity. And there it was, the sentence arrogant enough to sound strategic. The sentence men like him loved because it turned consequences into insubordination. I leaned back slightly in my chair. With respect, I said, the system held the leverage. I was the one preventing it from embarrassing you. The architect looked down to hide something suspiciously close to a smile. One of the finance directors did not bother hiding his. Vale spoke before Cross could answer. Focus. I brought up the timeline view. At 8:12, I was active in monitoring. At 8:14, Treasury latency warning appeared. At 8:16, I was presented with involuntary removal paperwork. At 8:17, I isolated privileged continuity access. At 8:19, approval chains began delay propagation. By 8:21, Treasury exposure modeling crossed the first critical threshold. I enlarged the number in red. By 8:23, I said, someone in finance finally asked the correct question. Vale's gaze shifted just briefly to Cross, not anger, worse, recognition, because anger is emotional, recognition is administrative, and administrative recognition can end careers before lunch. Cross placed both hands on the chair in front of him. If the architecture is that fragile, then the fault is structural. Correct, I said. He blinked, perhaps surprised I agreed so quickly. Then I added, but structure is not an excuse to cut the wrong beam first. A silence followed that felt almost elegant. Outside the glass wall, the city shimmered in gray-blue afternoon light. Far below, cars moved with the indifference only traffic and oceans truly master. Inside the room, 7 people were quietly recalculating the difference between authority and comprehension. Miriam turned to the architect. Can anyone else in the company assume continuity on this path today? He didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. Not safely, he said at last. Not without Elena present for a controlled transfer and validation window. Not Elena Markova, not Ms. Markova. Elena. That was how technical people apologized, by switching from title to truth. Vale looked at me. How long to stabilize? Initial continuity restoration, I said. 20 minutes. And full transfer? If you want it done correctly, observed, and resistant to this happening again? Yes, I held his gaze. Longer than the patience of anyone who caused this. The finance assistant looked down very quickly, shoulders tightening once. Suppressed laughter. Brave woman. Cross's face hardened. This is becoming personal, Miriam answered before I could. No, she said. It became legal before it became personal. That was your contribution. Beautiful, absolutely beautiful. Cross turned toward Vale. Richard, with respect, we cannot conduct operations based on dependency to a single employee and then reward obstructive behavior when challenged. Vale finally sat down, slow and deliberate, like a man lowering a final signature onto a page nobody else had read carefully enough. When a bridge is unstable, he said, you do not begin by firing the engineer standing in the middle of it. He said it quietly, which made it hit harder. Cross went still. There are moments in corporate life when a person can feel their own title loosening. You can almost hear the stitching go, not because anyone announces it, because the room stops arranging itself around their confidence. That was the moment for him. I could see it. He could see that I could see it. And that more than the report, more than the legal errors, more than the 70 million in modeled exposure, was what finally put a crack through the glass version of him he had been carrying around all morning. Vale slid the termination sheet to the center of the table with 2 fingers. "Ms. Sloan," he said, "I want a formal review of authorization sequence, document origin, and executive overreach exposure." Cross inhaled. "Executive overreach?" Miriam did not look at him. "You're welcome to hear the phrase again more slowly. No one rescued him, not HR, not finance, not title. The room had moved on to arithmetic, liability, and survival. I turned back to the screen, opened the continuity recovery interface, and entered the first restoration sequence. The system acknowledged my credentials, then paused, just long enough to make everyone at the table lean inward by instinct before the status line shifted from amber to green, one chain restored. Treasury latency dropped by 11%. A finance director whispered, "There," like a man watching a heartbeat return on a hospital monitor. I initiated the second restoration. Another pause, another green line. Vendor reconciliation queue stabilized. No applause. Real rooms never applaud. They just exhale. Cross stared at the screen as if numbers had personally betrayed him. But numbers don't betray anyone. They simply refuse to flatter incompetence for very long. I was about to trigger the third continuity bridge when the assistant's laptop chimed with a priority mail flag. She looked to Vale, then at the subject line, and the color left her face just enough to matter. "Sir," she said carefully, "Internal Audit has requested immediate preservation on all communications related to this action." Miriam closed her folder. Vale did not blink. And Daniel Cross, for the first time since I had seen him, step out of the elevator that morning wearing authority like polished armor, looked exactly like what he was. Not powerful, not strategic, not new leadership. Just a man who had mistaken a living system for a line item. I rested my fingers over the next command and looked at the screen glowing across the room. 3 more steps to stabilize, 1 audit hold already triggered. And somewhere in the chain above Cross, someone had just realized this story was no longer about a removal. It was about responsibility. The third continuity bridge came back online at 9:07. Not with drama, not with music, not with the cinematic satisfaction people imagine when disaster is pulled back from the edge. Just a quiet shift from amber to green, a line, a status change, a visible drop in treasury delay, and in rooms like Executive Conference B, that was louder than shouting. No one said anything for the first few seconds. They just watched the dashboard the way people watch a monitor after a patient starts breathing on their own again, afraid to speak too early, afraid to interrupt recovery with something as clumsy as ego. I finished the next sequence, then the final one, clean and logged, each action mirrored to the audit trail, every credential path witnessed and time-stamped. By the time the last dependency settled into stable range, the architecture map had stopped bleeding color. The urgent reds faded into orange, then yellow, then the restrained green executives loved because green let them pretend the panic had been theoretical. It never is. Vale stood at the end of the table, one hand against the chair back, reading the screen as if numbers might still decide to embarrass him out of principle. "Exposure estimate?" he asked. One of the finance directors checked his laptop, recalculated, checked again. If stabilization holds, projected loss drops out of critical range. Material delay risk remains, but the 70 million cascade scenario is off the table. There was the softest release of pressure in the room. Tiny, human, dangerous if misunderstood, because relief is when careless people start editing history. Cross seized it exactly the way I knew he would. So the event was preventable, he said. The sentence entered the room with polished shoes and bad intentions. I leaned back in my chair, hands still near the keyboard. Yes, he looked almost encouraged. Then I added, by not creating it. The architect coughed into his hand. The assistant very suddenly found her notes fascinating. One of the finance women pressed her lips together and looked at the wall as if the city outside had become wildly compelling. Cross straightened. We've now confirmed the architecture had an unacceptable single-point continuity dependency. That is the actual issue. Miriam Sloane closed her pen cap with a soft click. No, she said, that is the issue you would prefer to discuss. His jaw shifted. General Counsel, you are not being interrupted, she said coolly. You are being corrected. Every room has a moment when pretense stops receiving oxygen. This was that moment. Vale turned to me. Can the system run without further degradation today? Yes, I said, provided nobody improvises against process again. Cross gave a short, humorless laugh. That's a remarkable amount of attitude for someone in your position. I turned to him for the first time in several minutes. It is interesting, the precise second when a person realizes their title no longer creates fear. The sound usually leaves the room before the awareness reaches their face, but once it does, everything in them becomes more brittle. The shoulders harden, the voice sharpens, the eyes begin looking for agreement before the sentence is finished. He was there now, and he knew it. In my position, I repeated. You mean the one where I just prevented your executive shortcut from becoming an 8-figure lesson? He took one step toward the table. You're forgetting yourself. No, said Vale. Cross stopped. The CFO had not raised his voice. He did not need to. No one here is forgetting anything, Vale said. In fact, memory is becoming the primary concern. That was a beautifully cruel line, and everyone in the room knew it. The assistant typed it down. Miriam opened her folder again. Internal Audit's preservation request came in because their automated triggers detected overlap between executive authorization activity, abnormal access disruption, and a material finance exposure event. She looked at Cross with the dry calm of a snowfall over a battlefield. That is not an ordinary flag. Cross folded his arms. Not confidence now, containment. Audit flags are not findings. Correct, Miriam said. They are merely doors. The silence after that was exquisite. Vale moved to the screen and studied the live dashboard for another long second. I want post-incident transfer planning started immediately. Formal, observed, documented, no vanity deadlines. That last phrase struck the air like a paperweight dropped on glass. Cross must have heard the insult inside it because he spoke too quickly again. Richard, with respect, this validates my concern. We cannot be hostage to legacy talent who build relevance around irreplaceability. There are sentences that sound intelligent only to the person who says them. This was one of those. I folded my hands loosely. You keep using the word hostage, I said. That's interesting considering the only person who tried to force a system movement without lawful sequence was you. His eyes flashed. You locked access. I documented and sealed privileged continuity pending proper transfer. You obstructed leadership. I prevented invisible credentials drift during an invalid offboarding action. His voice rose half a degree. Same thing. Miriam did not even blink. Legally, those are not remotely the same thing. Cross turned toward Vale, perhaps hoping authority would behave like an elevator button, press it harder, go back up. Instead, Vale asked the architect, was her action technically sound? The architect did not hesitate. Yes. Was it proportionate? Yes. Did it prevent a worse event? A pause, then, almost certainly. Not certainly, almost certainly. That was the language of professionals. Tight, careful, defensible, nothing theatrical, nothing inflated, which meant it carried weight. Cross looked around the table as if searching for one person willing to step into the space where his certainty used to live. He found none, not one. That was when the room truly left him. Outside the glass, clouds had moved over the city. The light turned colder, flatter, more honest. The skyline looked like a row of decisions nobody had fully paid for yet. Vale sat again and steepled his fingers. Daniel, he said, and it was the first time he had used the man's first name in the room. Oddly intimate, more ominous than anger. Walk me through your sequence. Cross remained standing. I made a restructuring call. No, said Vale. Walk me through the sequence. A beat, then another. Finally, Cross began. I reviewed the department's concentration of operational authority and determined it represented a governance weakness. Who did you review it with? Vale asked. I didn't require a committee to assess managerial imbalance. That wasn't my question, Cross inhaled through his nose. I discussed organizational efficiency with HR. Miriam asked, which lawyer signed off? He didn't answer immediately. She waited. That kind of waiting should be studied. Lawyers like Miriam Sloan could turn silence into a blade and then hold it there until someone leaned forward into it on their own. No lawyer signed off, he said. Vale's expression did not change. Which security governance officer approved immediate access revocation? Miriam asked. Cross remained silent. Which architecture lead validated transfer readiness? Asked the architect. Silence again. Which finance risk owner was notified that the named continuity holder for a treasury-linked path was being removed? Asked one of the finance directors. Still silence. There it was. The anatomy of arrogance laid out not as psychology, not as opinion, but as absent names. Nobody needed a speech anymore. Absence was enough. Cross finally said, I did what I believed leadership required. Vale looked at him for a long moment. Leadership, he said quietly, is not the freedom to ignore sequence. No one breathed loudly enough to be heard. The assistant stopped typing again, perhaps because some sentences deserved to arrive in the notes without keyboard noise. My phone buzzed on the table beside me. I glanced down. Ava, Treasury Stable. People are whispering your name like a court order. What is happening up there? I almost smiled, but not quite. What was happening up there was not dramatic, not in the way people downstairs would later tell it. There were no raised fists, no slammed folders, no grand moral speeches delivered to the rain-streaked skyline. It was worse. It was administrative reality. And administrative reality is where careers go when the music stops. Miriam turned to me. Ms. Markova, when you were presented the document, what specifically alerted you first? The version header, I said, then the routing code, then the missing authorization field. You noticed all three immediately? Yes, Cross muttered. Convenient. I looked at him. Pattern recognition is only convenient to people who don't have it. The architect made the mistake of letting a real smile escape that time. It vanished quickly, but not before the room saw it. Even Vale noticed. Miriam nodded for me to continue. I also knew the timing was operationally reckless, I said. Treasury overlap window had already begun. Regional reconciliation was live. Approval latency had started to shift before the paperwork even hit my desk. Vale turned to finance. Could that have been caught earlier? The woman from the elevator answered, only if someone had warned us a critical continuity holder was being removed in the middle of settlement alignment. That landed exactly where it needed to. Cross said, again, if a single employee knows that much, that is a structural failure. Yes, I said, and if an executive acts on that fact without understanding its live implications, that is a leadership failure. He opened his mouth. Vale lifted one hand. That was all. Cross said nothing. The meeting changed shape after that. Not visibly to a stranger, maybe, but completely to anyone who had lived long enough inside corporate glass. The center of gravity moved away from blame performance and into record construction. Miriam began listing preservation scopes. Finance started naming impacted workflows. The architect outlined emergency transfer controls and mandatory abstraction milestones. Every sentence now assumed the event had happened, the exposure had been real, and the triggering act needed to be documented in language sharp enough to survive review. Cross was no longer participating in a strategy discussion. He was sitting inside an evidence ecosystem. He seemed to realize it at the same pace a person realizes a room is filling with water, slowly, then all at once. Richard, he said at last, voice measured again by force, I think this is becoming disproportionate. Vale looked at him with the calm fatigue of a man who had spent too many years cleaning up after expensive confidence. No, he said, disproportionate was trying to remove a critical technical dependency with incomplete paperwork and no lawful sequence. Another silence. Outside, rain had begun to stripe the glass in thin silver lines. The city blurred softly, towers dissolving into watercolor shapes, headlights turning to little smears of amber below. Inside, the conference room felt sealed off from weather, and yet somehow shaped by it, a pressure front trapped under fluorescent order. Miriam slid a fresh document across the table toward Vale. For immediate action, she said. He read it, signed it, did not narrate it, did not explain it. But he passed a copy to internal audit by hand rather than through the assistant, and that told me enough. Cross noticed too, of course he did. His face changed in small ways only attentive people would catch. A set to the mouth, a stillness in the shoulders, the sudden caution of a man mentally reviewing every email he had sent in the last 48 hours. That was the funny thing about power in offices like this. People thought it vanished dramatically. It rarely did. Usually it just stopped arriving on schedule. Vale turned back to me. How long do you need to prepare a controlled transfer plan? If you want a real one, I said, by end of day for the framework. 72 hours for the first safe separation stage. The architect nodded immediately. That's reasonable. Reasonable? Cross snapped. She creates the dependency and then dictates the timeline? I did not answer. Vale did. She did not create the budget deferrals, the migration postponements, or your morning decision, he said. At this point, Daniel, the most efficient thing you can do is stop speaking until counsel tells you otherwise. And there it was, not suspension, not removal, not yet, but something colder, a narrowing, a line drawn in language so precise it barely seemed emotional at all. Cross stared at him, then at Miriam, then at the rest of us. No one moved to help him. No one rushed to soften the sentence. No one offered the graceful corporate fiction that this was all a misunderstanding among leaders aligned around common goals. Because sometimes the room knows better. Sometimes the room has finally seen enough. My screen showed stable chains now, treasury flow normalized, reconciliation intact, alerts down to background noise. The system, for the moment, had forgiven the building. That was generous of it. I closed the live dashboard and began outlining the transfer stages in a fresh document while the rain continued drawing vertical bars down the glass. Across the table, the assistant's laptop chimed again, another incoming notice marked priority, then another right behind it. She looked up. HR is asking whether the termination action should be entered as completed, she said carefully. No one spoke, not even Cross. Vale extended his hand. She passed him the screen. He read the message once, then again, expression flat as polished stone. When he finally looked up, his gaze did not go to me. It went to Daniel Cross. And in that exact second, with the rain on the windows, the audit hold in motion, the system stabilized, and one fatal question hanging untouched in the middle of the room, everyone understood the same thing at once. The morning's worst mistake was no longer technical, it was procedural. And procedure, unlike pride, leaves paperwork. The room held still around that HR message the way glass holds rain, quietly but not gently. No one rushed to answer it. That was the first thing that told me the real decision had already been made. When people still believe there is room for maneuver, they talk fast, they improvise, they wrap bad facts in softer language and call it coordination. But when a room goes this still, it means the architecture has shifted, not the technical one, the human one. Vale kept his eyes on the screen for a long second, then handed the laptop back to the assistant. Reply, he said. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. He spoke with the calm precision of a man closing a door that would not be reopened from the same side. Termination action is not to be completed. Record it as invalid pending legal review. Freeze all downstream workflow. No status change, no system entry, no archive routing. The assistant nodded and typed. Across the table, Daniel Cross did not move. It was extraordinary, really, how quickly a title could lose its temperature. An hour earlier, he had walked onto my floor like a verdict in a tailored suit. Now he looked like a signature waiting to be questioned. Miriam Sloan opened a second folder, thinner than the first, and slid one document toward Vale, another toward me. Ms. Markova, she said, this is a temporary continuity authorization memorandum, narrow scope, effective immediately. It restores observed authority for stabilization and supervised transfer planning only. Not a gift, not gratitude, something better. Recognition in legal language. I took the document and read it carefully. Counsel observation. Architecture witness. Finance awareness. Logged scope. No theatrical promises, no emotional repair, just a clean acknowledgement that the company had nearly stepped on its own throat and would now prefer not to do that twice. I'll sign, I said, after one correction. That made Cross look up. Perhaps he still imagined refusal, drama, leverage, the sort of things men like him understood because they mistook them for strength. Miriam did not blink. What correction? I placed one fingertip on the second paragraph. Add that no continuity holder can be removed, suspended, or bypassed during live settlement overlap without legal sequence, architecture validation, and finance notification. A beat. The architect gave a single quiet nod before anyone else could speak. Yes, he said, that needs to exist. One of the finance directors added, agreed. Miriam took back the paper, uncapped her pen, and wrote the language in the margin with neat, surgical strokes. Cross let out a breath through his nose. So now policy is being drafted in the room by the person who created the concentration risk. Vale turned his head slowly toward him. There are many kinds of looks in corporate life. Encouragement, irritation, diplomacy, performance. This was none of them. This was the look a person gives a machine that continues making noise after being unplugged. No, Vale said, policy is being corrected in the room by the person who understood the risk before you touched it. That ended something, not officially, not on paper, but visibly. Cross fell silent in the way people do when they finally understand that further speech will only create cleaner evidence. The rain on the windows deepened, silver threads turning the skyline into a blurred painting of money and weather. Down below, the city kept moving, indifferent to executive embarrassment. Cars turned, lights changed, deliveries arrived. Somewhere, someone bought lunch. The world has a rude habit of continuing while reputations begin to crack. Miriam amended the memorandum, slid it back, and this time I signed. Then Vale signed. Then the architect, then finance, a small sequence of names, nothing dramatic, and yet it carried more legitimacy than the entire performance Daniel Cross had staged that morning. Procedure, when done properly, has a strange beauty to it. Cold, perhaps, but beautiful. Now, said Vale, folding his hands, we deal with the second issue. No one asked what the second issue was because everyone knew. The system had been stabilized, the event had been documented, the exposure had been modeled. What remained was responsibility. Miriam turned to Cross. I need your phone. His head snapped slightly toward her. Excuse me? Company phone, she said. Now, pending preservation scope. He stared at her. She held the gaze without effort. You are not being asked for consent, she added. That line landed in the room like a thin blade laid carefully on velvet. Cross's hand moved slowly to the inside of his jacket. He placed the phone on the table, not slammed, not tossed. Set down, like a man still hoping dignity might survive if he handled the optics gently enough. Miriam passed it to the assistant. Chain it to audit. The assistant stood and left the room with the device as if carrying something radioactive. Cross looked at Vale. This is excessive. Vale's voice remained even. You created a material finance exposure event through unauthorized sequence. Excessive would have been if the system had not recovered. That sentence stayed in the air for a while. I think everyone present understood that it was not just an answer. It was a line history would later use. The architect began outlining the transfer phases with me, his tone shifting fully into technical cadence now that the room had stopped pretending this was a matter of executive style. We discussed role abstraction, control pairs, emergency substitution logic, observed cutover windows, finance identified protected settlement periods, compliance added notification checkpoints, Miriam marked which actions required counsel presence. It was real work now, the useful kind, the kind that appears only after ego has been removed from the machinery with pliers. Cross sat down at last. Interesting, very interesting. He had spent most of the meeting standing as if height alone might preserve the illusion of command. But now he took the chair without being invited, and somehow that looked more revealing than anything he had said. He was no longer trying to dominate the room. He was trying to remain in it. After 40 minutes, the first draft of the controlled transfer plan was built. Not finished, but real, structured, defensible, capable of surviving contact with morning. Vale reviewed the outline, then looked at me. I want you back on 23 today, he said, with full observed authority under this memorandum. A simpler person might have treated that like vindication. It wasn't. Vindication is emotional. This was operational necessity wearing better tailoring. Still, I would be lying if I said there wasn't a certain cold satisfaction in hearing it said aloud, in that room with Daniel Cross sitting 3 chairs away and saying nothing at all. I'll return, I said, on one condition. Of course I had one. Rooms like this only learn when the lesson costs enough to remain visible. Vale's expression did not change. State it. No public theater, I said. No spin about misunderstanding. No suggestion I acted improperly and was graciously restored. I return under documented authority, quietly, correctly, and the people on my floor hear one thing only, that continuity is active and governance procedure is being updated. The architect murmured, "Good." Finance agreed immediately. Miriam closed her folder. "That is the cleanest version." Vale nodded once. "Done." Cross looked at me then, finally, directly, with a face that had lost all its earlier lacquer. Without the performance, he looked older, less dangerous, more ordinary. It was astonishing how much of menace depends on an audience. "You're enjoying this," he said. The room went silent again, but not out of shock, out of curiosity. It was the kind of sentence that reveals more about the speaker than the target. Men say it when they cannot imagine discipline without emotion, precision without revenge. I met his gaze. "No," I said, "I'm respecting it." He frowned just slightly. "The system," I clarified. "The process. The cost of pretending either one works because someone in a navy suit says so." No one interrupted. No one softened it, because by then the room had become honest enough to tolerate accuracy. Vale rose. "We're done here." Not loud, not ceremonial, final. Chairs moved back, folders closed, screens dimmed. The meeting dissolved not into chatter, but into tasks: audit, legal, transition, reporting lines, real things, necessary things, the things left behind after vanity burns off like morning fog. As we stood, Miriam touched the amended memorandum once with 2 fingers and said to me, quietly enough that only I heard, "You noticed the version header in under 2 seconds?" "Yes." A faint, dry, almost smile touched her mouth. "That explains a lot." I wasn't sure whether it was admiration or warning, possibly both. Outside the room, the corridor lights seemed too bright after the pressure of Executive Conference B. The assistant reappeared from audit, empty-handed now, moving quickly. 2 directors peeled off toward finance. The architect stayed beside me as we headed for the elevator. At the far end of the hall, Daniel Cross was intercepted by a man from internal audit and another from legal operations. Not grabbed, not dramatized, just redirected. Again, that was always the difference between fantasy and corporate reality. Nobody dragged you out unless the building wanted spectacle. Real damage was usually done politely. The architect pressed the elevator button and glanced sideways at me. "You know," he said, "half the company probably thinks you just detonated something." I looked at the reflection of the floor numbers in the polished steel doors. "I didn't detonate anything," I said. "I closed the valve before the leak found a headline." That made him laugh once, under his breath. When the elevator opened, we stepped inside together. 23, back up. The ride felt different this time, not triumphant, cleaner than that, as if the building itself had stopped speaking in assumptions and returned reluctantly to facts. My phone buzzed again. "Ava, please tell me if I should panic, celebrate, or update my resume." I finally smiled. "None of the above," I typed back. "Just root approvals normally. The adults found the report." Her reply came before we hit 19. "That is the most terrifying sentence I've read all year." By the time the doors opened on 23, the floor had already heard enough to fall into that distinctive office silence reserved for scandal, money, and sudden reversals of gravity. People looked up, not all at once, but enough. Monitors glowed, chairs turned. Conversations cut themselves short mid-breath. On the wall screen, the dependency dashboard ran clean again, green lines steady, latency down, no visible trace of the panic that had nearly escaped into the bloodstream of the company. My desk was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing: the termination paper was gone. In its place sat a sealed envelope with a red legal tab and my name typed neatly across the front. Observed authority restoration. Even here, the company preferred symbolism delivered through stationery. I set my bag down, opened the envelope, read the memo once more, and placed it beside the keyboard where everyone nearest could see the header if they were curious enough and discreet enough to survive corporate life. Then I sat. No speech, no glare, no petty little ceremony of reclaiming, just the chair, the screen, my hands returning to the keyboard as naturally as if the whole morning had merely been an especially expensive systems test. Ava appeared at the edge of my station 2 minutes later, trying very hard to look casual and failing in a way I found almost endearing. "Are you—" she began, then lowered her voice. "Back?" I logged into the monitored console under restored authority and watched the system accept the credentials without protest. Green confirmation. Observed scope active, continuity holder recognized. "Yes," I said. She glanced around, then leaned in the slightest bit closer. "People are saying the CFO reviewed a $70 million dependency report because of what happened." I kept my eyes on the screen. "People," I said, "should spend less time saying things and more time reading routing paths." That made her bite back a laugh. On the far side of the floor, someone's phone buzzed, then another, then another. Quiet ripples, messages moving through departments the way weather moves over glass towers, unseen directly but obvious from the light changing. No doubt HR had received new instructions. No doubt finance had its version. No doubt audit was already building a timeline sharp enough to shave titles with. And somewhere else in the building, Daniel Cross was likely discovering the most unpleasant truth in corporate life. A system will tolerate arrogance longer than it should. A balance sheet will not. I reopened the dependency maps and began annotating the first formal transfer stage. The office slowly resumed breathing around me. Typing returned, chairs rolled, a printer started somewhere behind storage. The ordinary sounds of a building trying to act as if it had not just watched power trip over process in broad daylight. By noon, the rumor had condensed into one clean sentence floating from floor to floor, from treasury to compliance to ops to whatever polished little corners executives used to reassure each other. The system depends on her. That wasn't quite true, of course. Systems should never depend on one person. But this one had depended for one dangerous morning on one person being careful while someone else was careless. And that was close enough for gossip. I saved the transfer draft, time-stamped the first phase, and looked once at my reflection in the dark edge of the monitor. Calm face, steady hands, no victory speech waiting in the throat. Because the deepest reversals are rarely loud. They do not need to be. Sometimes all it takes is one incomplete document, one live dependency, one CFO with the correct report in front of him, and one woman calm enough to shut down access before the building learns the price of disrespect. By evening, the rain had stopped. The skyline came back in sharp lines, washed clean. And somewhere behind closed doors, people would spend a very long night deciding how to write the morning into official language without admitting how close arrogance had come to becoming loss. But on the 23rd floor, beneath the hum of servers and fluorescent light, with the network stable and the memo beside my hand, the truth had already settled into place. He said I was out. The system answered first. And after that, there was only silence.